Hey guys, tonight let's slow everything way down. Dim the lights, unclench your shoulders. Let the day quietly wander off into the distance. Tonight we begin with Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra, the eyeliner icon, the last queen of Egypt. The woman who launched 1,000 history documentaries and at least 4 wildly inaccurate movies. But we're not here for epic battles or dramatic trumpet music. We're here for the softer stuff, the strange routines, the emotional spiral of very powerful people making deeply tired decisions, the long exhale at the end of an empire. So get comfortable, let your brain loosen its grip on productivity, and let's drift gently into ancient Alexandria. Cleopatra VII Philopator was born into a family that treated sibling rivalry like a competitive sport. The Ptolemies were Greek rulers sitting on an Egyptian throne. They married their own siblings constantly, because of course they did. Nothing says stable dynasty like keeping the family tree aggressively circular. By the time Cleopatra showed up, the dynasty had already spent generations politely sabotaging itself. Assassinations were common. Poison was practically a seasoning. Everyone had trust issues. Cleopatra, however, was sharp. Unusually sharp for a royal household that mostly specialized in dramatic exits. She spoke multiple languages. She actually bothered to learn Egyptian instead of just ruling it from afar. She understood people, which is a dangerous skill if you're surrounded by ambitious relatives. She became queen as a teenager alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. They were technically married, because dynasty. But it was more of a political hostage situation than a romance. Power struggles happened almost immediately. Cleopatra was pushed out. Then she pushed back in. Then Rome wandered into the situation like a very large, very nosy neighbor. Enter Julius Caesar. Older, ambitious, already halfway to legend status, Cleopatra met him dramatically, smuggled in a carpet. Because subtlety was not part of the brand. They became allies, then lovers, then parents to a son, Caesarion. Cleopatra briefly lived in Rome. Caesar got assassinated. Because Roman politics had absolutely no chill, Cleopatra returned to Egypt, regrouped, and eventually aligned herself with another Roman heavyweight, Mark Antony. Antony was many things: a talented general, a gifted orator, a professional overindulger, the kind of man who treated moderation as a personal insult. Cleopatra and Antony bonded fast. Politics, power, luxury, mutual admiration for dramatic gestures. They threw enormous feasts, sailed golden ships, played at being divine royalty. Because when you're trying to impress the ancient world, you don't exactly go minimalist. They had children together. They planned a future that looked very shiny and very unrealistic. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Octavian, Caesar's heir, was watching this whole situation with the expression of someone who did not appreciate sharing power at all. Octavian was calm, methodical, extremely patient, the kind of man who alphabetized grudges. He painted Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign seductress, Antony as a man who had lost his Roman discipline. Public opinion slowly tilted, because propaganda works even when everyone pretends they're immune to it. Eventually, tensions hardened into war. The famous naval showdown at Actium didn't go well for Cleopatra and Antony. Their fleet collapsed, momentum vanished, morale evaporated. They retreated to Egypt. Not triumphantly, more like quietly, with the emotional energy of someone realizing their group project is about to fail. Alexandria waited. Warm, familiar, heavy with memories. Cleopatra was now in her late 30s. Still intelligent, still politically alert, but tired. So tired. She began preparing contingency plans, negotiations, fallback options, letters sent carefully, like chess moves written on papyrus. She explored the idea of surrendering gracefully to Octavian, maybe saving her throne, maybe protecting her children, maybe preserving dignity. Octavian was polite in his responses, which is never comforting. Antony, meanwhile, drifted between optimism and despair. Some days he planned a comeback. Some days he stared into the middle distance like a man realizing the party had officially ended. Cleopatra built herself a mausoleum. Yes, while still alive. Just in case. Nothing says confidence like pre-ordering your own tomb. She filled it with treasure. Gold, jewels, royal heirlooms. A lifetime of accumulated sparkle. Part of her hoped this would serve as leverage. Part of her simply wanted control over something in a situation that was rapidly slipping away. Octavian advanced steadily toward Egypt. No rush, no drama, just methodical pressure. Antony's remaining forces weakened, loyalty thinned, defections increased, which is always how empires quietly unravel. Cleopatra continued negotiating, sending envoys, testing possibilities, protecting Caesarion's future as best she could. Octavian made reassuring noises, again, not comforting. Rumors began circulating. Miscommunications multiplied, nerves tightened. At some point, Antony received word, possibly inaccurate, that Cleopatra had died. And Antony, being Antony, reacted emotionally rather than fact-checking. He attempted to end his own life. Not efficiently, more tragically awkward than heroic. Then, in a cruel twist of timing, Cleopatra was revealed to be alive, which made everything dramatically worse. Antony was carried to Cleopatra's mausoleum. They reunited in a scene that was probably very emotional and very exhausting. Not romantic in a cinematic way, more like two people realizing they had reached the last page of a very long story. Antony died soon after. Cleopatra was now alone, with children, with a collapsing kingdom, with Octavian approaching. She met with Octavian personally. He was respectful, controlled, impressively calm. Cleopatra attempted charm, intellect, negotiation, subtle emotional appeal. Octavian listened carefully, promised safety, promised stability, promised very little really, while sounding like he promised everything. Cleopatra slowly realized what awaited her. Not execution, not immediate punishment, public display, a triumph procession in Rome, paraded as a defeated queen, a living symbol of conquest. For someone who had ruled as a goddess queen, that was not an appealing retirement plan. So Cleopatra returned to her mausoleum, thought quietly, weighed options, looked at the future with clear eyes. And this is where the story gently narrows, not with fireworks, not with shouting, just with long, careful decisions unfolding in slow motion. She arranged her affairs, wrote final messages, ensured her attendants understood instructions, placed symbolic items nearby. There are multiple ancient accounts of how exactly she died. Some say a snake, some say poison, some say a combination of clever chemistry and royal planning. The truth is fuzzy. History tends to blur delicate moments. What matters more is the intention. Cleopatra chose her ending rather than surrendering control of her image, her body, and her narrative. She died quietly, without spectacle, without theater, just the closing of a long and complicated life. Octavian was reportedly annoyed, which feels on brand. He had wanted her alive for political theater. Instead, he received silence. Cleopatra was buried beside Antony, together again, two ambitious humans who flew too close to Rome and discovered gravity still works. Her children's futures unfolded unevenly. Caesarion did not survive Octavian's consolidation of power. The others were absorbed into Roman households, raised politely, removed gently from political relevance. Egypt became a Roman province. The age of pharaohs ended, quietly, like a candle burning down to a stub and then simply going dark. And Cleopatra, real Cleopatra, faded into legend, painted as seductress, enchantress, manipulator, femme fatale. when in reality she was a multilingual administrator navigating collapsing geopolitics while surrounded by ambitious men and unreliable allies, which is significantly less glamorous but far more human. She loved, she calculated, she adapted, she misjudged, she hoped, she lost. Just like everyone else, only with more gold furniture. Let's gently float onward soon. There are more royal lives to drift through, more quiet catastrophes, more slow-motion emotional spirals wrapped in silk and ceremony. But for now, let Cleopatra's story settle into the background hum of your thoughts. Soft, ancient, unrushed. All right, welcome back. Get comfortable again. Maybe adjust the pillow. Let the room stay dim and quiet. We're still floating in the warm, dusty afterglow of ancient Egypt. The kind of heat that makes time feel slower, like even history itself has decided to lie down for a bit. Cleopatra's story technically ended with her death, but history never really knows when to stop talking about someone. It keeps echoing, soft ripples moving outward for centuries. So let's drift gently through the aftermath, the emotional cleanup phase of an empire, which is never glamorous, mostly paperwork and quiet disappointment. Octavian remained in Egypt for a short while. He had administration to organize, loot to catalog, statues to relocate. Empires don't pack themselves. Alexandria adjusted to its new reality. Roman banners, Roman officials, Roman accounting habits, which are thrilling if you love spreadsheets carved in stone. Cleopatra's palace emptied slowly. Rooms once full of perfumes, scribes, musicians, and political whispering became quiet. Footsteps echoed a little longer. Dust settled a little thicker. The great library had already suffered damage years earlier. Now the city itself felt like a memory in progress. Cleopatra's tomb location was lost over time, which feels oddly poetic. The woman who controlled her own ending vanished into historical fog anyway. History loves irony. Octavian returned to Rome with his victory neatly packaged. He staged his triumph, displayed Egypt's treasures, displayed symbols of conquest. But Cleopatra herself was missing from the spectacle. A ghost in the parade, an absence people still talked about. Octavian soon became Augustus, first emperor of Rome, a title that sounds calm and dignified and absolutely not like the result of decades of civil chaos. He reshaped Rome into an empire that preferred stability over theatrical collapse, which is sensible. Rome had done enough dramatic spiraling for one civilization. Cleopatra's children became footnotes, raised under Roman supervision, educated, polite, safely distant from power. Their royal blood quietly diluted into the endless flow of Roman aristocracy. Dynasties dissolved like sugar in tea. Meanwhile, Cleopatra herself underwent a strange transformation in storytelling. Roman writers portrayed her as dangerous temptation incarnate, a foreign enchantress who bewitched noble men into bad decisions. Because obviously it couldn't just be that powerful men sometimes make questionable choices all on their own. Much easier to blame eyeliner. Poets romanticized her beauty. Playwrights dramatized her love. Painters exaggerated everything. Hollywood would eventually do the same, but with better lighting. The real Cleopatra, the multilingual bureaucrat with strong negotiation skills and a slightly exhausted nervous system, rarely gets stage time. Her personal habits were probably much less glamorous than legend suggests. She held long meetings, reviewed documents, managed grain supplies, argued about taxes, not exactly perfume commercial material. She likely worried about her children constantly, about alliances shifting overnight, about betrayals brewing quietly behind polite smiles. Royal anxiety is still anxiety, just with better furniture. Antony's reputation fared no better. He became the tragic lover, the reckless general, the man who lost everything because he followed his heart, which is a poetic framing, also a simplification. Antony made political errors, strategic miscalculations, personal excesses. He trusted people who benefited from his failure. He underestimated Octavian's patience. Basically, a normal human stack of mistakes just scaled up to empire size. And somewhere between myth and reality, Cleopatra and Antony became symbols instead of people. Symbols are easy. People are complicated. Let's float gently backward now, back into Cleopatra's quieter personal world during her final months. Not the grand politics, the small rhythms. Mornings in Alexandria were likely warm and hazy, servants moving softly, curtains catching light, the smell of the sea drifting in. Cleopatra probably kept routines, even during crisis. Humans love routine when everything else feels unstable. She would receive reports, listen to advisors, send messengers, review numbers, ask practical questions about food supply and shipping. Even as the empire wobbled, she also likely spent time with her children, teaching, listening, trying to make their world feel safe for at least a few hours a day. Which is a strange emotional balancing act, preparing for possible disaster while pretending everything is normal at lunch. She knew the stakes. She understood Roman politics well enough to read between Octavian's polite lines. She wasn't naive, just hopeful in the way exhausted leaders sometimes allow themselves to be. There were moments when escape may have crossed her mind. Fleeing east, rebuilding somewhere quieter, becoming a retired queen with a dramatic backstory. But logistics are stubborn. Children are slow travelers. Armies block routes. History doesn't always leave convenient exits. Her final decision wasn't impulsive. It was measured, controlled, almost administrative in its calmness, which is oddly fitting for someone who spent her life managing chaos. Ancient writers debated the method endlessly: snake or poison, basket or vial, dramatic symbolism versus practical chemistry. Modern historians lean toward poison being more likely. Snakes are unpredictable, hard to transport discreetly, bad listeners. Poison, on the other hand, can be measured, reliable, quiet, very Cleopatra. Her attendants reportedly followed her in death, which speaks to loyalty, fear, cultural expectation, or some mix of all three. Human motivation is rarely tidy. The mausoleum sealed. The treasure inside no longer mattered. Gold becomes surprisingly irrelevant at the end of things. Octavian ensured she received a royal burial, partly out of respect, partly for optics. Public relations existed long before social media. Rome absorbed Egypt's grain supply, which stabilized food for the empire. Very practical, very unromantic. The Mediterranean world shifted slightly on its axis, not with fireworks, just slow political gravity settling into a new shape. Cleopatra's memory wandered through centuries. Medieval scholars debated her morals. Renaissance artists obsessed over her death pose. Victorian writers alternated between scandal and fascination. Everyone projected their own anxieties onto her, which famous women tend to experience endlessly. She became a mirror more than a person, yet beneath all the layers of storytelling, a simple human life remains visible. A young woman raised in a ruthless household, a clever mind navigating inherited instability, a leader balancing survival and ambition, a mother protecting children, a ruler facing inevitable loss. No magic, no curses, just humans doing their best in a messy world. Let's drift gently now toward the wider theme. Because Cleopatra is only one chapter in the long library of royal emotional chaos, history is full of powerful people making deeply human mistakes, marrying for politics and resenting it later, trusting the wrong advisors, underestimating quieter rivals, overestimating their own momentum. Dynasties collapse slowly, rarely with thunder, mostly with paperwork and fatigue. Cleopatra's story echoes forward into countless royal lives: queens trapped by alliances, kings undone by ego, children raised as political tools, all wearing crowns that are heavier than they look. And as we move forward in this long, sleepy journey through royal oddities and gentle disasters, you'll notice patterns repeating. Different names, same emotional software, ambition, love, fear, hope, regret, all moving quietly beneath silk robes and gold trim. So take a slow breath. Let your thoughts soften. Let Cleopatra's long shadow drift into the background. Welcome back. Let's settle in again. Stretch if you need. Let the quiet seep into your limbs. We've lingered on Cleopatra's final months, her measured decisions, and the calm precision with which she closed her life. Now it's time to float gently into the lingering echoes of her presence, the personal, the intimate, the human side of a queen whose image history has flattened into myth. Even after her death, Cleopatra's influence was everywhere in Alexandria. The city remembered her routines. The palace walls remembered her voice. Even furniture and tapestries, if they could whisper, would recall the hum of her household. Reports read aloud. Gentle scolding of servants, laughter or sighs shared with children in quiet corridors. Her children lived with the residual weight of her choices. Caesarion, technically the son of Julius Caesar, was brief in history. Octavian had no patience for alternative claims to power. The boy was quietly removed from the political landscape. His name whispered, not loudly sung. Other children, like the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene II, were absorbed into Roman households. Raised safely, far from crowns, far from expectation, Cleopatra herself, even in death, remained politically astute. She arranged her mausoleum carefully, ensured her attendants followed instructions, created a narrative in stone and gold that subtly defied Octavian's triumph. Because she understood one fundamental truth: controlling your story is as important as controlling your kingdom. History, of course, loves simplifications. Roman historians portrayed her as manipulative, as dangerous, as seductive. Because blaming a woman for the mistakes of powerful men is always convenient, in reality, Cleopatra was something more complex. A ruler facing systemic collapse. A mother protecting children. A negotiator attempting to survive in a world where diplomacy often came with threats of death or exile. She spent her last days carefully, almost bureaucratically, meeting with Octavian, organizing her mausoleum, checking on children, reviewing contingencies. Even a queen, it seems, must do inventory before the end. The reports of a snake or poison are mostly symbolic. They speak to desire for drama. In truth, Cleopatra's death was methodical, quiet. Her final act was one of control. Self-possession in a situation where the world was spinning beyond her grasp. The mausoleum itself, possibly located somewhere near Alexandria, disappeared into history. The precise location lost. Adding to the mystique. History loves a good ghost story. Octavian carried on with Rome. He staged the usual triumphs, absorbed Egypt into the empire, praised for stabilizing the Mediterranean grain supply. A practical man, unfazed by human stories that didn't fit his narrative. Yet Cleopatra's story persisted. Roman propaganda cast her as a cautionary tale. Later generations romanticized her. Poets, artists, filmmakers all projected fantasies, fears, and ideals onto her memory. And still, beneath all the myth, she remains human. Not a goddess, not an enchantress, not merely a political tool. She was a young woman managing impossible expectations, a skilled negotiator navigating collapsing alliances, a mother worrying over children's futures, a queen facing inevitable loss, a strategist balancing hope against reality. Her emotional life, I imagine, was rich, complex, and exhausting. Moments of quiet contemplation between reports, soft smiles with children, sighs when letters arrived with bad news. Small victories in maintaining dignity in a shrinking world. And perhaps that is the most compelling part, that Cleopatra, whose name conjures glamour and seduction, was really someone making human choices in extraordinary circumstances, trying to hold herself and her family together, one careful, deliberate decision at a time. Her story is not heroic in the cinematic sense. It is a story of human endurance, strategy, and quiet dignity under pressure. And as we drift away from Cleopatra, it's worth noticing the pattern, the slow, deliberate unraveling of a life spent balancing power, love, and survival. History is full of such stories. Royal figures navigating dynastic chaos, trying to control a world that refuses to be controlled. The palace corridors, once bustling with life, quieted. The city adjusted. The empire shifted. Time passed, inexorably, gently, and without fanfare. But Cleopatra's story remained, carved into memory, literature, art, and eventually, cinema. Not for the accuracy of events, not even for the glamour, but for the resonance of a human being exercising agency in the face of overwhelming odds. So as you sink a little further into calm, let that settle. The quiet dignity, the careful planning, the private moments between political turmoil. History, for all its grand battles and empires, is made up of such moments, small, human, quiet, moments of control, choice, and inevitability. Let Cleopatra's life and her measured exit drift with you, the soft echo of a queen who ruled, loved, and chose her own story in a world that was anything but calm. And soon, we'll float onward. More dynastic chaos, more royal peculiarities, more intimate glimpses of lives behind crowns. For now, let the story of Cleopatra's final days rest, like a warm, heavy curtain falling across an empire that once held so much light.